Fresno, welcome to Drew Scott Decker and Bert Decker. Would you come on up here, please?
This is fun. You know, I don't know whether many of you knew up here, but I got a golfing weekend that I didn't expect to get. You see, my wife, my sweetheart, bid on that. We were up here, and all of a sudden I saw this bidding going on right over my shoulder. I love golf. She doesn't like golf. I know, and some of you are in the same situation. The interesting thing is and we're going to talk a little bit later about, we do specials for each other. I immediately saw it, this was a special. Here she's bidding on a golf that we're going to go out and have fun on, and I really appreciate that. I'm looking forward to it. I hope we can come back next year. Can we just, wait on tables or something to come back?
Yes.
This is great. It's really great to be here for several reasons. Number one, we got here in the first place. We're from San Francisco, as you know, and when we left this morning, we have been intently watching the weather. I don't know if you watch the weather reports, but there's a Pineapple Express that comes up from Hawaii, and that's what we're all under. So here's this thing coming from Hawaii, coming right over San Francisco and going right to Fresno. Actually, it comes up a little bit to the left. Well, what's interesting is we left San Francisco and thunderstorms, downpours. I mean, it was the worst of it. Had some friends here who said it's pretty bad, better because we left a little early. We got to Patterson Pass Road, and we saw some clouds out there, and then we saw no rain. Wow, it's incredible. There was no rain from Patterson Pass Road to Fresno. You know what? Here we're coming to speak at this Sweetheart Banquet tonight, I think. It's kind of like the Red Sea parting, don't you think? I really had that thought. God, you're wonderful. This is terrific. Also delighted to be here for several other reasons. And before I forget this, the book mentioned, this is the first time I can take co-credit for the book. Because normally I'm the author of You've Got to Be Believed to Be Heard. It's a book on communications that I wrote, but I didn't write it alone. I wrote it with somebody. That somebody is from Fresno. We don't see each other that often, but he is here tonight. Jim Denny, would you just stand up? I'd like to credit the co-author of You've Got to Be Believed to Be Heard. He's a great writer. He has co-authored some books with Michael Reagan, and he just told me this model, Alexis something or other. I don't know how that fit into the mix, Jim, but it's kind of interesting. And also our very good friends, Rob and Peggy Robbins. I don't know how long we go back, but it's way back when we all lived in Danville. When they were kids. And I was mentoring them or something. But it's great to get, we're going to stay with them tonight. It's great. It's just great to be here with you all. Many friends from CBMC. 18 of us went to St. Louis a couple of weeks ago on wasn't quite a chartered flight, but we had a great time going to St. Louis to the CBMC Men's Conference. So it's great to be here. We're going to share some of the things that have happened in our life together with you. And I think the best way to do that is have the better half and my best sweetheart in the whole world start. So here is Drew Scott.
I didn't grow up in Fresno, but I did grow up in the Valley. I grew up in Redding, California. How many of you know where Redding is? Yes? Is it the place you drive through that's very hot and you drive through out there on your way to someplace else? You can imagine what an identity crisis that was, being for the place that people drive through. But I have a lot of memories about Redding. One of them was my mother, who I admired very much for her accomplishments. Many nights when I was growing up, I can remember hearing the squeak of her bedroom door as she got up during the night, and she walked across the hall to the hospital bed where my father was. My father had been a very strong man, a carpenter, very muscular, and he had Parkinson's disease and a stroke. And he was paralyzed for 7 years in a fetal position. And I can remember my mother getting up and moving him every 2 hours so that he wouldn't get bed sores. And so I grew up with a strong sense of admiration and valuing accomplishments. and I wanted to accomplish. And so probably wouldn't be too much of a surprise to end up being on the Good Morning America show, talking about a book I had written that was Book of the Month Club. And it was the fulfillment of a lot of energy and a lot of dreams and sweat over a number of years. And I can remember as I left the broadcast, which was broadcast live to over 7 million people, and getting in the black limousine, and I kind of relaxed in the back seat of the black limousine, and the driver turned back to me, and he looked at me, and he saluted his cap, and he said, "You must feel on top of the world." And I can remember nodding yes and feeling no. I had this empty feeling that this dream that I thought would be so fulfilling, this accomplishment, was really not fulfilling. And I can remember feeling as though if there had been a gauge not on the limousine but on me, and that gauge had represented a feeling of satisfaction or meaning, that gauge would have had the dial way over on empty. And as I rode back to the Plaza Hotel, I can remember thinking, I have to do something about this. And I thought of someone I needed to call.
About this same time, I had a gauge on empty. This was, I guess, around 1980s, late 1970, 1980. And, but I filled it with different things. I had married a woman named Deborah Kane. And she had gone to good school back east. She'd gone to Smith. I got to Yale. We got married. We had a kid. Actually, we got a dog. And then 6 months after you get a dog, you have a kid. And then you get a house with a white picket fence and all those kind of things. So I kind of did that. And it was and had some success. It was in the film business. And around that time, I had my own company. And to the outside world, we were quite successful. We had 3 kids, and she was working in the company with me, and it was on the surface successful. Underneath, it was corrupt. There was abuse of alcohol. There was unfaithfulness. There was debt. As a matter of fact, at that time, as an entrepreneur running my own company, I didn't know how to handle money at all. And what I did was, a couple of times I borrowed against the taxes that I had to pay. And some of you, I hope, have never done that, but you know about it, or you might have been tempted to it. Because every time when you're an entrepreneur, you think, one more month, the ship's going to come in. One more month, the ship's going to come in. I had personal debt also, $25,000 in credit card debt. I mean, things underneath were real bad. And I wasn't an absentee father, but I was really interested in making a career, achieving something, building my company. I had 3 good kids, but underneath, nothing. So what did I do? About that time, I separated.
When I got back to San Francisco, I called a friend of mine and a neighbor who had been just I thought she was a bit unusual. In fact, I thought she was a bit extreme. But when the chips were down, I knew that her gauge wasn't on empty. And I called Dr. Elizabeth Paith Lasker, who was the head of the public health service clinics for the 7 western states and also a neighbor. She and her husband at that time had 4 children, and she really seemed to have a lot of meaning and satisfaction in her life. And so I called her, and we did what we've done every month or so, every couple of months. That was have breakfast at 6:30 Saturday morning and then go for a walk on the beach. So we're in San Francisco. We had breakfast at the little cafe just above the Cliff House. And we went for a walk on the beach, and I could hardly wait to get on the beach to ask her the question that had been burning on my heart ever since that driver in the black limousine. And as we walked along the beach, I turned to Elizabeth and I said, you know, with all of these things, I feel empty. I feel spiritually flat. What should I do? And Elizabeth walked along, and she walked along a few more steps. And I thought to myself, as I look back at this in retrospect, that was a time when I thought I had all the answers. I'd had over 200 radio, television, and newspaper interviews that year. I was the dispenser of answers, not questions. So when I had a question for Elizabeth, she really kind of looked at me and I think, does she really want to know the answer to this? And as we walked a few more steps along the beach, and I remember seeing those little birds kind of skittering along the ocean's edge, right where the water comes up and meets the sand. And as we both looked at that, she turned and stopped and looked at me. And her hair was pulled back in a kind of a knot like this, gray hair with little beads of the dew on her hair. And she looked at me and she said, well, if you don't want to feel spiritually flat, all you have to do is, for 1 year, pray and read something in the Bible every day. Well, I was hoping for something a little more profound or mysterious, a pilgrimage or something. I had never read the Bible, but I had a lot of opinions about the Bible. And I can remember thinking, well, it seems so strange. And she asked me, said, if you stop by my house this afternoon, I'll give you one. And so she gave me a Bible, and it was gold. It was a Good News Bible. And she opened it up, and she put a check mark. There were actually 6 X's. She put an X in front of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Psalms, and Proverbs. And she said, you might enjoy starting with these particular sections. And so I went back, and I can remember before reading the Bible, I had thought that life and eternity was very much like what I saw when I walked into a courthouse when I was growing up. Remember this courthouse? And it had the statue of justice with the scales on each side. And I remember thinking that if, when you came to your last days, and I believe there was, something after you died, and what I thought it would be like that courthouse statue. And I thought that I would stand there and God would say, did more good things than bad, come on in. And particularly said, you've had some really good accomplishments, come on in. And as I read the Bible, I began to see that it was not that way. Even though I had a lot of opinions about the Bible, I was really quite surprised by what I found in it. The thing that surprised me most was the fact there was one word that kept coming up over and over and over again. And that word particularly stood out for me in the quote which said, "Fear not, little flock. It is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." And all this time I thought it was earn the kingdom. And it was really quite startling to me. And I can remember reading, "For God so loved the world that he gave," and again that word jumped out, "his only Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life." And as I read all of these passages about giving, I began to see my accomplishments in a different light. I also began to see that the Bible called a number of things I was doing by different names than I had been calling them. And I can remember one morning being in Grace Cathedral, which is this beautiful Gothic cathedral in San Francisco opposite the Fairmont Hotel, and sitting in the pew and looking up and seeing on the wall a beautiful cross and recognizing for the first time in my life that it was not a piece of art. It was not just something beautiful and artistic. And I recognized for the first time in my life that Jesus had died on that cross to pay for the wrongdoing I had done and to give me a right relationship with God. And I can remember as I walked forward to take communion, as I had a number of times, and knelt, I looked up and saw the stained glass windows with the light coming through and shining in that red and purple and gold light and silhouetting the priest's head. And as I looked up and saw the silhouette of the priest's head and heard him say, I heard it for the first time. He said, "This is the body of Christ, which is broken for you." And for the first time in my life, I knew the body of Christ was broken for me, Drew Scott. That it wasn't just broken for good people and Americans and people who didn't rob banks, that it was broken for me, and that he had paid a great price tag so that I could have a relationship with God. And at that moment, I asked God to take control of my life and to direct me and to control my every move and thought. And from that moment on, everything changed.
God was not in my life when I was separated. You had a very self-centered man. But I knew I needed change. And I knew also I happened to be, I think I was 41 at the time, and people said I was going through midlife crisis. I said, no, I just want to build a business. 41 at the time. It was about 8 months, and I decided I wanted my family. I wanted Deborah back. And so I went back and I said, yes, we need counseling. I'll go to counseling wherever you want. Now, she had come to faith about 3 years before, and I had nothing against that. As a matter of fact, I followed her wherever she went and wanted to go to church, and she was always a spiritual seeker. But she went to this one church and accepted Christ, and that was fine with me because it was irrelevant to my life. But when I came back, I did say, whatever kind of counseling you want, Christian, non-Christian, I know I need counseling, we need counseling. We'd done it once before, by the way. We did it with a guy Rob and Peggy will remember, Orville, who was pastor of the church later on, but at that time, I didn't know him and went into counseling, and of course I was in this self-centered place, and he said, Bert, you got to have your priorities straight. I mean, first there's God, then family, and then there's work. I said, no, Orville, you got it wrong. First there's work, then family, and then there's God if you have any time. That's where I was at. So I knew I needed help, but I didn't know what kind of help. I just needed change. So I went one Saturday morning to a guy named Bill McGinnis. He was a Bible teacher of Deborah's, and I was going to interview him for marriage counseling. I went in at 10 o'clock, and we began talking about Jesus Christ. Because I was always interested. I was interested in leaders intellectually. I didn't know anything about the Bible at that time. I didn't even know the first 4 books of the Bible, of the gospel, were all the same story. I mean, I didn't know anything, but I was interested. So we were talking after about a half hour or so. I felt my eyes kind of well up. When you're looking at somebody and you're kind of intense and your eyes will sort of well up. But I didn't want to touch go like that because he might have thought I was moved or something. So I didn't do that for about 10 minutes or so. And then I was really touched. I was moved. I was changed. And I ended up getting on my knees and accepting Jesus Christ into my life as my personal Savior, which I never thought that this rational, go-getting guy would ever do. Changed my life. I went back and we joined a church, and about 6 months later, I went to my first men's conference at a retreat. Some of you know of Mount Hermon. Came back from that and went out to dinner with Deborah, and we were having great times. This was beginning our walk in faith and with God. And she said, Bert, I have a little lump in my breast, and I don't think anything of it. And doctor didn't either, but of course went right to the doctor, but did a biopsy, and there was something of it. And she had breast cancer. And that began a 2.5-year struggle with cancer that she lost. And I can't tell you the inspiration of that woman who never, ever gave up faith. And I didn't either, and the kids didn't either. I'll never forget the memorial service. I mean, Jesus Christ was there with the power of 400 people, all in tears, not just remembering this woman, but where she had gone. And it was very difficult, of course, for me. I had the company to run. We had the best 3 years of our marriage during this struggle because we had Christ at the center of our lives. But still, it was very difficult because I now had 3 kids who had no mother.
My relationship with my mother was very complicated. Do any of you have or know about a complicated relationship with your mother? Would you raise your hand if any of you know about this? Yes, I see a few hands, probably about 50% of you know about a complicated relationship with your mother. Well, on one side, I adored her. I loved her. I admired her. She just was a tremendous woman of accomplishment. And on the other side, they had this kind of push-pull, because by this time, over 2 million people had read my books or seen my films. Films were in 10 languages around the world. Books were translated into French and Spanish and Portuguese. And yet, I would call my mother most evenings, and I remember one evening I was sitting on the bed in the hotel room, and I called her and I was telling her about working for a particular airline on a project, and my mother said something that revealed the dream that she had for me, that she had had for a long time, and I usually could take it in stride, but this time, remember, I did not take this professionally, I took it personally. She said, well, honey, if you do well for the airline, do you think it could work into a real job? I almost bit the telephone cord in half. And yet I knew why she wanted me to have a regular paycheck. When I was in Redding growing up, and before my father became ill, he was a carpenter and a lumber grader, but a carpenter most of his life. And I can remember my mother walking to the kitchen window many, many mornings, like maybe even this morning, pulling back the curtains, looking out, and seeing rain, and saying, no work today. So I knew why she wanted me to have a paycheck, even if it rained. But it was this kind of struggle. And the main thing the three big things changed in my life after that turning point day in Grace Cathedral, when I knew that Jesus loved me individually. And the first thing that changed was my relationship with my mother. Because until that time, I had approached my mother almost like grabbing her by the collar and just saying, you must love me, you must love me. And I can remember when my mother died without ever saying the words, I love you. And I wanted her to say the words. She told me she loved me in thousands of actions, but I wanted her to say the words. And what happened is that my relationship with her changed drastically. And it changed drastically because I continued doing the thing that Elizabeth had encouraged me to do during that time when she encouraged me to read the Bible. And that was to pray. And so I said, Our Father who art in heaven, may your holy name be honored. May your kingdom come. May your will be done on earth. And I really, for the first time, realized that it wasn't just my father. He was her father. And now I could approach her without this needy grabbing by the collar saying, you must give me unconditional love. Because I knew that I had that from my good shepherd. That totally changed my relationship to her. I didn't approach her from a needy point of view or a sensitive point of view anymore. The second thing that changed was very dramatic change in my relationship with my work. I can remember before knowing that Jesus loved me individually, being in a group, and I felt like I would have to please everyone in that audience. And if the audience, somebody was frowning or disagreeing or doing something, I would almost do cartwheels on the table to get to them to make sure that I was, something of value, that they liked me. And what happened immediately was a sense that there was only one person in my audience now that I had to please. I wanted to please the rest, but there was only one person I had to please, and his name is Jesus Christ. And that freed me. I can remember being up at Silverado one time speaking, and they had the tables kind of like this, and they were sitting, and right about in this area, a man pulls up a newspaper, opens it completely out. And in the past, I would have gone to pieces. I mean, I would have been down next to his elbow trying to get that newspaper down. I wanted him to like me. And I looked at it and said, well, it's obviously not of value to him. So I just kept on. But before knowing that Jesus was the only person in my audience, that would have driven me wild. And I remember afterwards, this was a program for the top performers in a brokerage firm. And he was the husband of one of the women who was the top producer. And I said, well, this is a complicated situation, so I'm glad I didn't take that one personally. So in addition to the relationship with my mother, the relationship with my work, the biggest change came 5 years later when I married this wonderful man. And he's going to tell you a little bit more about that. But the situation that I walked into was one that I had prepared for primarily by reading women's magazines and talking with all my single friends. And I noticed that my single friends had a view of marriage that is not what my married friends now have of it. You know, their view was untarnished by facts. Although Elizabeth had told me when I first introduced her to Bert that she thought that marriage was God's way of preventing and healing rigidity and self-centeredness. I did learn that was true, and am still learning that. And I can remember we'd been married a year and a half, and at 18 months, I knew the honeymoon was over. Bert knew the honeymoon was over. Alice and Sam and Ben knew the honeymoon was over. And I can remember standing in front of the refrigerator one night after dinner, and I'd got in the habit of making quite a few trips to that refrigerator after dinner, and during the middle of the night, I might add. And standing there and feeling like, I feel like I have no skin. And someone has this immense salt shaker, and they're shaking it on me. I was in the most pain I'd ever been in my life. And I did what I did in New York. I said, I've got to call Elizabeth. So I called Elizabeth and I said, can I come and talk to you? And she said, well, if you wait until 9 o'clock, I'll have everything put away. So I was knocking on her door at 9 o'clock. And as I knocked on her door, I was so shaky. I felt like I was just about to fall apart. And she took me by the arm and led me into this little study with a little blue love seat in it. And I sat down in the love seat and I said, Elizabeth, this is tough. This is terrible. I've never been in this much pain. He's just not meeting my needs. This isn't what I expected. And then I asked her the other big question. Is there any biblical way to get out of this marriage? By this time, I thoroughly believed that reading the Bible daily had been the best thing I'd ever started doing. It was when I started understanding the character of God, and it's when I understand that I didn't have to sign up for so many optional classes in pain. I could follow some biblical principles and save myself a lot of pain. And so I didn't want to do anything that was unbiblical, and she's a real student of the Bible, having memorized the book of Romans. So I said she would know if there's any loopholes I haven't found yet. And I can remember Elizabeth looking at me for a long time again, and then as she looked at me, she took me by the hand and looked me in the eyes and said, no, there isn't. You are about to become a woman of prayer. And then she took my hand and said, let's kneel and pray right now. And we knelt on that blue love seat and prayed. And I can remember we got up a number of minutes later. It was probably the longest time I'd ever prayed. We got up and I got in my car and I drove back up the hill to our house with a different view toward marriage. You know, before I thought, well, if it didn't work out, I could do something else or something would happen. I didn't really have the 100% commitment that I had when I drove up that hill. And I drove up the hill and the creativity started to bubble. And I started working on my marriage like I had never worked before. And I started praying like I had never started praying before. And I even did so much research, I wrote the book, Stress That Motivates. Might as well turn it into something useful here. So that really was the turning point. And Bert and I learned a number of things that are biblical principles that helped in our marriage. But it was a very difficult first few years. And last October 1 was one of the nicest moments in the entire 10 years when I not only received a telephone call and email, but I received a beautiful letter from Allison, who is now 29, thanking me for the things that I had done for Bert and for the family. Now, this really meant so much to me. And then on December 15th, just a few weeks ago, I got a second letter that if our house were hit by a mudslide, I would grab that letter before the mud hit. And that letter was from Ben, who's now 23. And in the letter, he said, when Dad first married you, I saw you as someone who's trying to replace my mother. Then I saw you as my stepmother. Then I saw you as Dad's wife. And now that I'm graduating from college and entering the work world, I can see you as one professional to another. You know, and they tell you in the textbooks that it takes till 23 for that differentiation to occur. Well, it was almost, he was 23 weeks, you know, like 2 weeks later. So it was just amazing that happened. There have been many blessings in my life. And Harville Hendricks says something that I think of as so true, and it's happened to us. And it's one of the reasons God created marriage. He says that all of us drag around this filing cabinet behind us all the time. And this filing cabinet stays open until the ring goes on the finger. And when the ring goes on the finger, we start opening up the filing cabinet. And the filing cabinet has a label on the front of it called Unmet Childhood Needs. And so, and that the purpose of marriage is a safe, healing community where we can have those unmet childhood needs surfaced and healed. And I was a beneficiary of much of God's healing, and Bert was a beneficiary also.
I have to make a little correction. In the program, there was a miscommunication by phone that says that we're living with 3 teenage children. You can see there's something that doesn't connect with. When we got married, the memory is 3 teenage children. When we got married, they were all teenagers. And I thought, and I really thought this, I look back in such ridiculous glee, laughing at how foolish I was. I said, look, honey, marry me because I got these 3 kids and they're almost raised already. Did we have a lot to learn? You know, when I decided to start dating, I made a list of 3 women that I wanted to date. And this is the Sweetheart Banquet, so I'm going to tell this little romantic story. Drew was at the top of the list because I'd seen her best-selling book, and I liked her picture. I loved her picture. I mean, I didn't fall in love with the picture, but it was a really great picture. And I knew of her, and she knew a little of me because we were both in San Francisco and both in speaking, but we never met. So I gave her a call. She was back east at DuPont working. And I talked for about 5 or 10 minutes, said, Bert, I may not get this right, but I said something like, she said, what is it that you'd like? You know, after I was chatting a bit, and I said, well, would like to, I guess, take you out to dinner or something like that. He said, oh, well, that's interesting. And we went through schedules and all. We ended up talking for 20, 25 minutes. We talked most of the time about Jesus Christ. That, too, was not on my agenda, but it was on Drew's agenda. So Drew Scott, at that time, that was a couple of weeks before we had our first date. Our first date was on New Year's Eve, and it ended up going to Grace Cathedral for the midnight service on New Year's Eve, and I fell in love immediately and wooed her, gave her that line about 3 teenage kids already grown. You can see I'm persuasive, though, right? If that's the content. We got married not knowing what we're really getting into, or I certainly didn't. And I'm the kind of guy, which is kind of like 99% of the other guys, who you've got a problem, you love to withdraw. You know, go into something that you don't have to confront the problem. Drew Scott, if there's a problem, she wants to solve it. Right? And she came psychology degree and doctorate and all this stuff, so she had not the facts, but she had the education. So here we were. The kids are messy. I mean, when you grow up with them, you know. So here we were. She wanted to fix the problem. We'd be in conflict. I wanted to withdraw, and I figured, okay, I better do some counseling. And I learned that counseling is great. One of the things that Rob and Peggy do, they do intimate encounters, and I think somebody's going to talk about later. I hope so. It's a great program. I urge those of you who don't do counseling, who may have some difficulties, we would not have been where we are now without counseling, but above all, without Jesus Christ at the top of our triangle and us down here at the bottom of the triangle. Without that commitment, there's just too much and too many reasons to split apart that we could have made.
The filing cabinet.
The filing cabinet opens, no question about it. So I found that I had to work at it, and I had to learn how to listen. And I had to do a number of things that I wasn't comfortable with doing. I still don't like doing many of them. But gosh, what a difference it makes. What a difference it makes in our marriage. And one of the things that I learned largely from Drew Scott, because she truly is a prayer warrior. And I hadn't been a prayer warrior. But we made a commitment, I don't know how many years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that whenever we were in conflict, we would get on our knees and pray Ephesians 5, which is basically, the crux of it is, women, respect your husbands, husbands, love your wives. And every time I do that, I don't want to do that, but I do it because I made the commitment. But it is a struggle. And then we get down on our knees, and every time I do that, I'm confronted with my own self-centeredness. And it doesn't absolve the problems, we work at those, but it just makes such a difference. And I learned that from her, amongst many other things. I'll tell you, and I shared this at the men's conference a couple of weeks ago, we had a conflict, doesn't matter what it is, but we had one where I was really mad. I was angry. This was 2 to 3 weeks ago. Just before I was about to share some of my story with 650 men, just before we're going to come here, we had this big conflict. And I was not verbally abusive, but I sure was mean. Was I verbally abusive? Maybe I was. I'm not proud of some of the things I said.
I've forgotten.
She's forgotten. That's good. Well, this is what happened, though, and I was just, never happened before. I was mean. She was hurt. I knew she was hurt, didn't care. And she said, let's pray. So I went and prayed. But I didn't open my mouth. So she started praying. And then I realized what was happening. I realized that Satan was coming in. We're better to have the evil of hurt and conflict come in, but right then. And I began praying and weeping. And I confess to you, I began crying for seeing once again my own self-centeredness, wanting my own way, whether I was right or not. I'll tell you, there's such lessons that I learned, and I never would have learned without faith, without God in my life, without this woman in my life. The blessings have been just phenomenal. We have 3 kids now. Drew Scott has told you about the healing that has begun. It's not finished. The healing continues forever, but gosh, it's so much better. And I have 3 kids, all of who have faith, and it has made such a difference in their lives. It is such a blessing. My work is I don't know where I'd be in my work. I'm fairly competent, so it might be okay, but I know it wouldn't be anywhere near where it is right now. And that is purely through the blessings of God and trying to run it in the biblical manner, handling money in a biblical manner, having a guidebook, having a stake in the ground. It just makes all the difference. The blessings are just astounding. I am so lucky, and we are so lucky. And it is because we have Christ at the apex, and we are down here, and we love each other.
And I learned some very practical things about loving each other from a dear friend. And I remember we were sitting around the conference table in her office, and I turned to her and I said, Mary Lee, her name's Mary Lee Goody-Coons. I said, what do you do that helps you in your marriage? And Mary Lee said, she looked at me and said, well, it may not work for your marriage, but let me tell you what I do. Because she's been married 32 years, and they've had a lot of, things happening. And as I turned to her, she said, well, what I do, rather than go to my husband with a lot of needs, I remind myself that Jesus is my husband. Boy, I had never heard that. And it didn't appeal to me at all. And, and I can remember thinking about it. Marilyn said, well, you think about that for a while. And I can remember driving up the hill back up to our house and walking into the family room and telling Bert, I said, guess what? Mary Lee told me that it'll help with our marriage. And I said, she told me to think about Jesus is my husband, and he will meet all of my needs. And that way I can come to you and not be needy. Well, Bert bought into that immediately. And I can remember Bert saying, the husbands of Danville will rise up and call Mary Lee blessed. And I think that really is true. And even though I laughed about it then and I laughed about it now, that really has been a tremendous help for me, is to recognize that my husband is a wonderful blessing in my life, but Jesus is who meets all my needs. And when we got married, we had a particular quote included in our wedding service, and it's one that's included in the handout that you have, and I'm going to read it to you, but you can take this away with you later. I particularly like it in this translation. And there are...
Should we read it together?
Yes. There are 3 quotes, and the first 2 are short, and then the last one is the one that was in our wedding service. The first one is a quote from the Bible: "All things are possible with God." And I have said that to myself many times. And then the second one was a real major turning point, getting my nose out of my navel and having some bigger priorities. "Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things shall be yours as well." And then the quote that we had in our wedding service and we have on the wall of our kitchen is at the bottom of the page. "Love is patient and kind. It is not jealous or conceited or proud. Love is not ill-mannered or selfish or irritable. Love does not keep a record of wrongs. Love is not happy with evil, but is happy with the truth. Love never gives up, and its faith, hope, and patience never fail." We've been talking about our stories, but this is really a story of God's pursuing love. It's a story of God's power, and it's a story of God's purpose and healing. Thank you so much for your attention.